Thanks so much for being here and joining us today, Representative Khanna and Rodney Sampson. How are you both?
Doing well. Here.
Doing well, thank you. So we're here to talk about a very important topic of racial equity in tech across the United States. It's been an issue for a long time, and I think it's safe to say it's very important to all of us for a number of different reasons. Why don't we start out with defining what exactly is racial equity?
Excellent question. I'll kick us off. So thanks once again to Capital Factory, and thank you, Marianne, and Congressman, it's good to see you. So when I think about racial equity, I think about a process, and I also think about an outcome. And what I mean by process is think about applying restorative justice to every aspect of society. And then if you double click on business and you double click on the startup ecosystem, I made a comment on Twitter the other day that said, there won't be equity in the tech startup or venture ecosystem until over 50% or more of the investors, founders, boards, C-suite, engineers, managers, sales, operations teams, suppliers, go-to-market, investment, and impact is equitably represented by the descendants of the people who built America for free for 400 years. So that statement in itself hopefully sets a precedent that most of what we, I think, see and experience on a daily basis in the name of racial equity is a lot more performative than it is sacrificial. And I'll conclude with that, opening statement.
Representative Khanna, do you have any thoughts on what your definition of racial equity would be?
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Rodney. To me, equity means having the freedom and the ability to not only live a flourishing and meaningful life and live up to your highest potential, but also to be contributing to the national culture, to the national vision with an equal voice. And so equity is beyond just saying we have to give someone a certain salary or income or certain seats at the table. It's really about empowering people to have a true voice in our economy and in our political and cultural life.
Mm-hmm. I would say, we can all agree there's definitely a lack of diversity when you look at in the startup world in terms of who's being funded, who's doing the funding. What are your thoughts on what the tech sector, the public sector can do to help balance this out and combat against unequal access to capital and resources in cities all over the U.S.?
Well, I think we have to rethink the market incentives. I think tech has shown that unregulated, it's not capable of solving some of these structural issues. And in fact, it's exacerbated it. Rodney knows the statistics, but of the 80 billion or so venture capital, I think he would know exactly, but my sense is less than 1 billion or something is by Black and brown venture capitalists. So, and very little if it goes to Black and brown entrepreneurs. So why is that? It's because of the legacy of racism and a lack of intentionality in addressing it. I think tech has been so focused on quick speed, getting things done, that they have not been intentional about equity and what's best in the long term. So we need, I think, incentives, structural incentives that give big funds an interest, a tax credit for investing with minority venture capitalists. We need matching funds from the federal government to match the Black and VCs and Latino VCs. We need federal funds targeted for entrepreneurship and innovation in Black and brown communities. But I think unless you have federal policy, you're not going to see much of a change.
I agree. I mean, policy has been precedent, in this nation since its inception. It was actually policy that, legalized the enslavement of Black people in this nation. It was policy, state rights that fueled Jim Crow in this country. And so I think a lot of times the private sector may not want to work with policymakers, but it is incredibly important that we are not just, showing up to vote, but in addition, sitting with stakeholders who shape policy and can convene decision makers around that process to help to create new policies. I'm encouraged by the possibilities of the infrastructure bill. I'm even encouraged by some things I saw in the last stimulus, and just hopefully that the translation of that, when it gets to the agencies and the states, will think about equity in the startup ecosystem. But policy aside, I was having this conversation with my buddy over at National Venture Capital Association, Bobby Franklin, and they work on a lot of policy issues as well. Is if we can get limited partners, the LP, the investors and funds, to adapt a framework of what we call DAIS, diversity, equity, and inclusion solutions, for their investments and or fund, then if the fund managers then also have a standard for the founders, that's when you actually will see the opportunity. OHUB just launched a certificate program with Stanford, Duke, and UNC Chapel Hill called DAIS on one side. And we believe that if you have founders excited about their DAIS canvas, just like they are about their business model canvas, you actually will start to see some change. And if you can teach people of color how to become investors in the asset class, because there are accredited investors that are Black, that are Hispanic, that are from other indigenous populations, they might not also know about the investment class yet. So through education, exposure, but also creating these best practices, I think we can start to see some structural change.
Recently, I covered some news out of a company, a fintech that was founded by a Mexican American, and he decided to take matters into his own hands and opened up his cap table, declared that I think it's 10%. He wanted 10% of his investors to be Black or Latinx. Strictly. I thought this was a very interesting initiative and not something I'd come across before. What are your thoughts on that, where founders really just being very proactive and deliberate about making sure that he has a diverse cap table?
I mean, I think that's good in individual initiative to try to do that. I think we have to look at the reality, though. First of all, you have a racial wealth gap where Black families have about $1 compared to $10 of white families. So part of the challenge of not having enough investment is that there is a lack of wealth there initially to invest. So I think you have to have broader federal policies that incentivize that and assist that to be able to overcome the racial wealth gap. I mean, the racial wealth gap is really a staggering statistic that Jim Crow, formalized Jim Crow, I mean, we have a modern day version of it, obviously, with the voting rights, but the formalized Jim Crow arguably ended in the 1960s. And since then, the racial wealth gap hasn't changed. If anything, it's increasing. I mean, something really is deeply wrong where you can end formal segregation in schools and countertops in restaurants, and that's not showing up in the racial wealth gap statistics. And that's why we have to, I applaud initiatives of someone who goes out there and says, I want to have a diverse tech workforce, I want to have diverse investment. But I think this problem is too Herculean, rooted in our original sins of slavery and in Jim Crow, where for 250 years, Black people in this country were considered less than. I don't think individual initiative is sufficient to overcome that kind of history. I think we need systemic policy change.
I would agree with Representative Khanna. It's going to take systemic transformational change in this country to even begin mitigating the racial wealth gap. The first thing is most Americans don't even think, when they think of race and racism, they're not thinking of it in terms of economics. They're thinking about it in terms of, and rightfully so, continue, police brutality, and we have race soldiers that have literally embedded themselves in the force. And a part of my distraction from my work today has been just literally thinking about what went on in Minneapolis again, surrounding a policeman killing an unarmed Black person for literally like nothing. And so I think that one, we have to have a deeper conversation about how racism has impacted people's not only ability to get educated, but to get opportunities. But when you think about it, I've spent most of my career as an outlier in the ecosystem, being one of the first Black founders to raise over $1 million in venture capital 21 years ago. Since that time, there have only been 300. Harlan Capital puts out an amazing diversity report showing the representation of Black and brown founders that have raised over $1 million. Now think about that. Only 300 in the last 20 plus years. And in 2019, there were approximately 11,000 firms, majority non-Black. So I think I kind of thought that was cute, Marianne. Like, hey, I'm going to open up my cap table to have some Black and brown investors. And I've seen a few iterations of that. And listen, if you've got the net worth, you should definitely be able to invest your money wherever you want to. But when I see these syndicates and these special purpose vehicles aggregate capital, and then I know I've got an inbox full of venture backable Black founders that can't raise the capital, where someone else is probably oversubscribed and has to say, well, I'm going to hold back just a little bit for you to get in. I would like to see that capital, honestly, go into Black firms first. Because that's where the gap is. Black fund managers, even like myself and my investment track record or my operating track record, we struggle to raise capital from our community because of the data. But at the same time, we struggle to raise it from more traditional LPs investors as well.
Yeah. One of the things, here I'm based in Austin. One of the things we've all been hearing all over the news is that more companies, more tech startups and VCs are moving to places like Austin, Miami. And Austin's a great city, of course, but it's never really been known for being very diverse. Do you have any thoughts on what all this migration means and what it's doing for the people already here? And is this only worsening the lack of diversity problem in cities like Austin?
I'll let Representative take that one. He's in San Francisco.
Well, on the one hand, the pandemic provides great opportunity, the post-response to the pandemic, because we've seen that not everyone has to be in Silicon Valley, not everyone has to be in Palo Alto, and you've had all these companies, Facebook and Coinbase and Twitter and Salesforce and Pinterest, say that they're going to go to a hybrid model and that people could be working from anywhere in the nation. The reality is, though, that the excluded communities, which I would argue are in three buckets, the Black community, the Latino community, and women and more overlaid around race, and then I would say rural communities, that we have not seen the dispersion as much as we would like to those communities. So what you've seen is dispersion from Silicon Valley, largely or more predominantly to New York and Boston and Austin and Seattle. and not this sense that we're overcoming the regional inequality, the racial inequality, the gender inequality of our community. But what we have is a moment to now have policy, intentional policy, because we now know that concentration in and of itself is not some mythic good. It used to be, people used to say, oh, you have to move everything to Silicon Valley. Well, we know that's not true. So there is an opportunity to have distribution of opportunity if we're intentional about it. But if we just allow it sort of to take its own course, I fear what you'll have is just concentration in a number of places like Austin and still massive exclusion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I agree. Reminds me of this Northwestern study that came out, I want to say 2017, that demonstrated where there's innovation density, there's increased income segregation. So in economic immobility. So if you look at how, East Palo Alto was regentrified and the Black and brown folks were pushed out. If you look at what happened in the central city of Seattle, I see it happening in Atlanta right now. Microsoft just announced a 90-acre campus in the hood, the ghetto. I mean, honestly, you're like, oh my God. And everyone's like, yes, that's a blighted community and we want it to be restored, but we don't want the citizens that have been paying taxes there to be displaced. I just saw an article where we're getting the MARTA station, which is our metro line, we're getting $50 million just for that station because Microsoft raised the money. And the community has been trying to get money to restore that station. So I would say you're going to have to be incredibly careful. And I was having this conversation a few weeks ago with Mayor Adler. He's joined forces with OHUB on our new equity district model, where your performative, programs around diversity, equity, and inclusion are admirable, but they're not enough. I would say, like our partners in this initiative, Div Inc. needs 100x. OHUB needs 100x. The upskilling boot camps to train the talent need 100x in funding. And I'll close with this comment. If you're a startup founder looking for an engineer, and you've got all these tech companies that can pay 2x and 3x of what startup founders can normally pay software engineers, what happens to the early talent that you might normally be able to scoop up to help you build out your tech company, versus now they'll just go take a nice cushy job at one of the big tech codes. So it's a lot to be considered. And we have to be strategic and intentional of not just getting caught up, with a sea of Patagonia kind of floating around downtown in East Austin.
Yeah, for sure. Totally agree with that. So I know we don't have a whole heck of a lot more time, but I'd love to hear more directly from each of you about anything in particular you might be working on that relates to these kinds of efforts with regard to racial equity, or just on this topic, anything in particular that you've got going on that we'd love to hear more about.
Sure. Well, our legislation, Endless Frontiers, that Senator Schumer and I are working on, is $100 billion on critical science and technology in this country. But we explicitly are carving out billions of dollars for the HBCUs to work with groups like the Opportunity Hub and others, I mean, not by name, but groups like that, to help create a new technology professionals. I mean, Rodney has a goal of 1 million Black men and women interested in becoming tech professionals. I think that's a great goal. And we need to have policies that will encourage that. Endless Frontiers could be one aspect of that. And then I've been pushing companies, Zoom and a few others, to partner with HBCUs. They may not go as far as people would like. Often they do a few scholarships, few jobs, but even that kind of intentionality in seeing that there's so much talent, it can make a difference, because right now there's a blindness to how much talent we're missing. And really, my goal is to convince tech leaders that this is not some act of charity. This is an act of investing in the brilliance that's out there. I mean, imagine if there was an entire, imagine if we didn't have literature with Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou, or if we didn't have music with the great Black artists. Well, we're missing that Black ingenuity, creativity, genius in tech. That's a detriment to tech. And we know this because we know that it's such a rich, vibrant contribution to so many other spheres of life.
Last summer, and the congressman and I had a lot of calls. We were texting back and forth. We were, right in the middle of this, and I know he's working on some things. We definitely look forward to ensuring that racial equity is a part of the Frontiers legislation, and OHUB and 100 Black Angels and Allies and other organizations that we know that do this work. We definitely will work to make sure that they are front and center. We worked with the Brookings Institution and the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City last year. We worked months working on a report on how to spur local recovery by ensuring racial equity in tech ecosystems. And it was the first time we had quantified how to actually close the gap at scale. And we identified a $26 billion market opportunity. That with $26 billion over a 20, 30, maybe even 40-year period of time, you could reskill and place 1 million Black and brown folks into technology careers, whether that's software development, whether that's cybersecurity, whether that's robotics, whether that's technical sales or software sales. We also carved out where we could pre-accelerate, accelerate, incubate, and back 10,000 high growth firms that had the potential to scale and to grow. And, a $26 billion number last year, they would have laughed the congressman and myself and Brookings and everyone else, out of Washington. But now when you have multi-trillion stimulus packages and an infrastructure bill on the table, we can make a real case for that. And the execution of that is what we call the equity district, going city by city and establishing these innovation districts that have equity built into the core, where upskilling and new venture creation and capital formation is incredibly integral to the actual programming. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, so I know this is a kind of a loaded question what I'm about to ask, and we don't have much time, but just a quick thought. And a lot of companies, a lot of investors announced certain initiatives last summer in response, I think, or in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of that was met with skepticism and wonder of why were you not already doing this? Why did it take this movement to get you to do these things? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or do you just welcome any initiative in general that was aimed at trying to improve this racial inequality?
Well, what I would say is, there was a lot of sympathy, a lot of solidarity with George Floyd in pointing a blame at excess of the police in talking about Black Lives Matter. But that's a pretty easy thing for a tech executive or a tech company to do, to say that the problem is out there with police forces. And obviously there's that problem, and obviously there's a problem of mass incarceration. But I'm a big believer that if we're going to tackle racial equality, it starts with each of us doing things that are in our own domain. That we can always point to as systemic inequalities in other areas, but that's what's much harder, is to be reflective about the inequalities in our own. And I think you finally saw, after months of just saying we're for Black Lives Matter and supporting sort of protests, people saying, no, okay, what are you doing to show that Black Lives Matter? And I think there have been encouraging initiatives. I mean, Reed Hastings gave a significant grant. But I think where we have to go beyond just giving a grant is you can't just write a check to the United Negro Scholarship Fund or write a check even to a couple HBCUs and think that that's sufficient. This is going to require a lot more imagination, a lot more active engagement in setting up the recruiting mechanisms and the hiring mechanisms that truly diversify workforce, as opposed to thinking you're sort of paying your tithes to the racial equality fund. And so it's a good start, but there's a long way to go.
I agree. Most of us that have been doing the work or, building companies in the ecosystem, we were somewhat of appalled that tech companies could easily stroke 20, 40, $100 million checks to organizations that absolutely had nothing to do with the ecosystem at all. And, we kind of couched it that folks didn't want to be canceled. They didn't want to be perceived on the other side of history. And then number two, during the general election, when Trump was pushing his platinum plan, which sounded like, getting a section at the club for Black America, and it was supposed to be this huge economic initiative, it was like repackaging old stuff. And so when we saw some of the announcements coming out of big tech and some of the legacy companies, when you do the research, it's like, oh, you already had this, going on. You just decided to call it a thing. And so the lived experience is that, look, I've been incredibly successful. I've created wealth, for my family. I've published 4 books and, been blessed, grateful, and have dedicated my life, literally invested millions of dollars into building up Opportunity Hub and making these investments in Black funds and founders, and grateful for the opportunity to do so. But I would say to all of my white peers in this space, and even my non-white peers that operate, proximate to whiteness and white institutions, is that they're really not doing enough. When I see Black board members, when I see Black women on your boards or Black men on your boards, when I see your C-suite Black, when I see your investments, your portfolio, and just, how I started off, until we see, 50+% of the existing capital going towards Black and brown firms, it's all performative, especially in an ecosystem that just continues to grow. It's not like it's finite, right? Every year it grows. There are more startups being funded. Companies are growing, creating exponential amounts of new wealth. So it's not like we're dealing in like a closed pie, but there's an ocean of opportunity. So
it's well said.
Yeah, I agree. I really enjoyed this. Thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today and share all your thoughts on such an important topic. We really
thank you, Mary. Always a pleasure, Rodney.
All right, see you.
Have a great day.